Chapter 1 and 2 of Mrs. Jeepers' Batty Vacation. Chapter 1 Weirdest Vampire of All. I have terrible news, Howie said to his friends Liza and Melody. They were gathered under the oak tree before the last day of school. Eddie jumped out from behind the oak tree and looked at his friend. Did you lose your mind? Ha ha, Howie said. If I weren't so mad about this summer, I might even think you were funny. What are you talking about? Eddie asked. We're going to goof off all summer. It'll be great. Melody nodded. We can play soccer every day. We're going to relax. Mrs. Jeepers made us work hard this year, Liza said. After having a vampire teacher for third grade, we deserve a great vacation, Eddie agreed. Most of the kids in their class thought Mrs. Jeepers, their teacher, was a vampire. After all, the brooch she wore every day did seem to have magical powers. Whenever anyone misbehaved, the brooch glowed and everyone shaped up. We can't be sure Mrs. Jeepers is really a vampire, Melody said. I know she is, Howie said. I saw the coffin in her basement. No one lives in a haunted house and has a magical brooch without being some kind of monster. Howie sighed. It doesn't matter anyway. Liza put her hand on Howie's shoulder. What's wrong? You look like someone just gave you homework for summer. Howie sighed. They did. My dad says I have to go with him on a scientific study. Yuck, Eddie said. That's cruel. How can your dad expect you to give up your summer to study science? Howie smiled. I won't be studying science. He's the scientist. I'm just going with him. He thinks the trip will be very educational for me. There are plenty of educational things to do in Bailey City, Liza said. If you leave, then who will play with you all summer? Then who will we play with all summer? Eddie argued. You'll have Liza and Melody, Howie said. I won't have anybody but my dad. Bummer, Eddie said, kicking the green grass under the oak tree. It doesn't seem fair, Liza agreed. Melody twisted her ponytail and smiled. Maybe we could talk to your dad and get him to change his mind. I don't think it would work, Howie said. My dad wants me to get some culture on this trip. There's culture in Bailey City, Liza said. Eddie rolled his eyes. The only Bailey City culture worth getting is doodle gum shakes. Forget about doodle gum shakes, Melody told them. Here comes Howie's dad. I'll get him to change his mind, Eddie said, and ran towards Howie's dad. Don't get me in trouble, Howie called after Eddie. But Eddie didn't stop. He ran up to Howie's father with Melody, Howie, and Liza right behind him. Dr. Jones, Eddie said. I don't mean to be rude, but I've got a question to ask you. Dr. Jones pushed his glasses up further on his nose and smiled at Eddie. What seems to be the trouble? Dr. Jones asked. Howie belongs with his friends this summer, Eddie said. Don't you want your son to be happy? Dr. Jones nodded. I want that very much, he said. As a matter of fact, I agree with Eddie. You do? Liza, Melody, Eddie, and Howie all said together. Hardly any grown-ups ever agreed with Eddie. That's why I've asked your parents if you kids can join us on our trip to Romania, Dr. Jones said. My company offered to pick up the tab. Howie's face lit up like a firework display. You mean Liza, Melody, and Eddie get to go with us? That's exactly what I mean, Dr. Jones said. All right, Eddie yelled as Liza and Melody jumped up and down. Howie gave his dad a hug. That's not all the good news, Dr. Jones said. There's more? Howie asked. I've spoken with your teacher, Dr. Jones told them. The four kids gulped when Dr. Jones mentioned their vampire teacher. Mrs. Jeepers? Howie asked. Yes, Dr. Jones told them. Mrs. Jeepers is from Romania. Her family still lives in the Transylvanian Alps, where we'll be staying. She is going home for a visit and has agreed to show us around. Mrs. Jeepers is going too? Howie asked. His face turned pale. Yes, Dr. Jones said. I knew you'd be pleased. You've had such an exciting year with her as your teacher. Well, I gotta go now. I'll see you all on Monday for the trip. No one said a word as Dr. Jones walked to his car and drove away. Oh my gosh, Liza said. We're going to Transylvania, the home of vampires. Eddie sat down on the ground with a thump. And the weirdest vampire of them all is going to be our tour guide. Chapter 2, Blood Sucking. Eddie shoved past his three friends to get to row 13. I get to sit by the window, he said. Melody, Liza, and Howie hurried to sit next to Eddie. They stuffed their Bailey School backpacks under the seats in front of them and buckled their seatbelts. Howie's dad found his seat right behind Howie. All four friends turned and started talking to Dr. Jones at the same time. Will we get to see a movie? Melody said. Can we have all the soda we want? Eddie asked. I'd like some peanuts, Liza added. How long will it take to get there? Howie asked. Okay, make an inference. What is the setting right now? Where are they? Yes, if you said an airplane, you're correct. Good job. Right, let's keep going. Suddenly, Mrs. Jeepers towered over the four kids. She smiled an odd little half smile and gently touched the green brooch she always wore on her throat. The four friends stopped talking at once. The plane trip to my home will take all evening, she said. Night is the best time to travel. Howie's dad leaned over the seats to talk to Liza, Melody, Eddie, and Howie. We're so lucky to have Mrs. Jeepers along with us. She'll know all the ups and downs of traveling in Romania. Most bats are good at ups and downs, Eddie said under his breath. Howie's dad continued to talk. Mrs. Jeepers will be a great tour guide and can give you a real taste of the Transylvanian Alps. Melody swallowed. I just hope we don't become a tasty treat for the Transylvanian vampires, she whispered to Liza. Liza patted Melody on the arm. We have nothing to worry about, she said. Howie's dad will be with us the whole time. But then Howie's dad grinned. Mrs. Jeepers has agreed to show you around while I work. She's even going to take you to her family reunion. Mrs. Jeepers smiled back at Dr. Jones. Neither of them noticed the worried looks on the faces of the four kids. My family cannot wait to have my students at the reunion. That will be a real treat. A reunion? Eddie squeaked. Mrs. Jeepers patted Eddie on the head. Yes, my brother Boris, my mother, and several of my dearest old uncles and cousins will be thrilled to have you visit. I thought your family had to leave Transylvania, Howie said, remembering something his teacher had told them long ago. Thankfully, most of my family. Oh, wait, let me go back here. I need to read this in Mrs. Jeepers' voice. My family cannot wait to have my students at the reunion. That will be a real treat. A reunion, Eddie squeaked. Mrs. Jeepers patted Eddie on the head. Yes, my brother Boris, my mother, and several of my dearest uncles and cousins will be thrilled to have you visit. I thought your family had to leave Transylvania, Howie said, remembering something his teacher told them long ago. Thankfully, most of my family has been able to return to our homeland. Mrs. Jeepers smiled her odd little half smile again and sat down. Eddie gulped, turned around, and ducked down in his seat. He grabbed Howie's arm and pulled him close. Did you hear that? Eddie whispered. Mrs. Jeepers said we're a treat. Her family is going to spread us on their toast like jelly. Maybe we can still get off the plane? Howie said nervously. Let's tell my dad we're sick. Just then, the plane engines roared to life. The plane raced down the runway and soon climbed high above the clouds. Eddie tugged on Howie's shirt. Howie, Liza, and Melody leaned close to listen what Eddie had to say. Mrs. Jeepers didn't get us during the school year, so now she's going to have her family do us in. Eddie told his friends, we're going to a get-together of monsters. We're doomed. I knew it, Melody said. We're going to be the main course of the vampire reunion. Shh, Howie warned. Mrs. Jeepers will hear you. Liza nodded. Besides, we never proved Mrs. Jeepers was a vampire. I'm sure her family is very nice. I bet Mrs. Jeepers eats hot dogs and plays badminton at her family reunion, just like we do. Have you seen her eat hot dogs? Eddie asked. No, Liza admitted. Have you seen her eat anything? Melody asked. No, Liza told her. But that doesn't mean a thing. It means we're in trouble, Eddie told her friends. It means you're batty, Liza said. Stop all this crazy talk. You're scaring me. Be careful, Melody told her friends. You know, when Liza gets upset, her nose sometimes bleeds. Eddie gasped. Oh, Melody's right. We can't let Mrs. Jeepers see blood. Whatever you do, Liza, don't let your nose drip blood, or it may be the last thing you do. Liza's eyes got wide, and Melody patted Liza's arm. We need to calm down, Melody said. All this talk of vampires is making us nervous. Just then, a hand reached out and squeezed Melody's shoulders. Ah! She screamed. Liza and Howie ducked, and Eddie covered his throat with his hands. I'm sorry, a sweet voice said. I didn't mean to startle you. Melody looked up into the smiling face of the flight attendant. Nobody said anything until the flight attendant finished putting trays of spaghetti and drinks in front of them. Soon they were too busy slurping noodles to talk. When they were almost finished, Melody tapped Liza on the shoulder. I have to go to the bathroom, Melody said. Can't you wait? Liza asked. Melody shook her head. Liza sighed and got up to let Melody out. When Melody came back from the bathroom and slid back into her seat, she looked ready to cry. What's wrong? Howie asked Melody. Are you getting airsick? Melody shook her head. I just saw Mrs. Jeepers' dinner, and you'll never believe what it was. Spaghetti, Eddie said. That's what everyone's eating? Not Mrs. Jeepers, Melody said. What are you talking about? Howie asked. But Eddie didn't wait for her answer. He kneeled in his seat and peered over the back. What he saw made him gasp. He fell back into the seat and grabbed Howie's shoulders. Melody is right. Mrs. Jeepers isn't eating. She's sucking blood out of a glass.